the purpose of the thing is not to grab your attention. The purpose of the thing is to engage your soul in a unique way. Let's engage an imperfect system in order to do real ground level work for people who have tremendous need.
And perfection in how they operate is not a prerequisite to engaging them and being a part of them.
It can't be. What happens is you earn that trust, and then you actually get to speak into the system, and it took us years, but it required that really adamant, like, we're about this place, we're about this hood, we're about this geography.
Welcome to Parish, a video podcast that celebrates, equips, and focuses on small churches and why they matter so much. We believe small churches are uniquely positioned to integrate in their communities and engage issues in ways only small churches can. I'm your host, Canaan Hurst, and this is episode 8, Neighborhood, Taking Spiritual and Social Responsibility, Part 1.
We're back with Nathan Hoag.
For better or for worse.
Here we are.
Yeah.
In the first episode, we talked a bit about parish model churches and kind of your story and why you ended up, but I want to go a little bit more in depth.
Yeah.
You were at a mega church, kind of at the time, fastest growing church in America, kind of the quintessential, what everyone seemed to be wanting.
Yeah, it's like everything you would imagine if you were like, close your eyes and think of like a suburban megachurch. It was like, the massive parking lot, the like massive auditorium, the high production value, huge staff. I mean, I think at the height when I was there, the staff was like, there was like somewhere between 150 and 200 people on staff, which is like significantly bigger than our entire church now.
Yeah. So most people, I mean, you talked about burnout, which like, I don't know a pastor who hasn't experienced it or isn't going through it.
On burnout, like probably at the highest rates we've ever seen. A lot of that's pandemic related.
Yeah.
And then I think also it's related to this kind of underlying like post-Christian culture that a lot of pastors are sort of like waking up to, it's sort of like realizing like, oh, this is the culture that this is becoming the predominant culture post-Christian. And now like, how do I manage and lead like a congregation or a group through that? So those things are all contributing factors to burnout. So we're seeing really high rates of that.
Yeah. It's just not like it was.
True. Yeah. It's just things are different than they were.
Yeah. So most people experiencing burnout at least would say, I'm going to make a lateral move to a different, but I'm not going to, kind of go lower or take a demotion, so to speak.
Yeah.
At least an influence or, size of church. You specifically chose a small, geographically focused, like, what is a parish model and why were you so convinced that that's something that you wanted?
Yeah, I mean, the answer to your second question was that it was just like deeply personal and it was survival. Like I was dying, and I don't even think I realized how bad it was until later on when I looked back.
But you realized it was because it was such a big...
But it was like our whole life was wrapped up in this culture of, I don't know, the kind of, the rat race, the progress, the, climbing the ladder, that all exists in church world too. Maybe more so than in other, industries or areas. I don't know. But yeah, we found ourselves, I just kind of like woke up one day and realized that we lived in this one community. We knew very few of our neighbors, despite some efforts. We just didn't really know them very well. We weren't home very much. We lived in Littleton. My wife worked in Aurora. I was working in Highlands Ranch. We had foster kids at that time who were with Douglas County, which means we were down in Castle Rock all the time. We do a lot of playing in the mountains. So every weekend we were up, skiing, climbing, biking, that kind of thing. Some of our closest friends lived in the Central Park neighborhood, which is like, basically an hour drive now through Denver traffic. We were just like, our whole lives were just completely disintegrated. Like there was no overlap in our life whatsoever. We were constantly in our cars. We were constantly not at home. And it was exhausting. And I remember just waking up one day and being like, I don't think I'm supposed to live this way. And I don't know that I even now can make this statement, like, I don't think anyone's supposed to live this way. Like, we're all doing it wrong.
Right.
But I was like,
That's kind of popular to do. If people make
yeah,
broad sweeping, now everyone has to follow
right.
this.
And like, my theory was, this is bad for me. It's bad for our family. It's probably bad for like some other people too. Maybe not everybody, but like, I bet we could rally whoever those people are around an idea that a more integrated, overlapped life is healthier, just like better for us. But because the world isn't set up that way, right? The automobile and the internet being the kind of two primary culprits that have caused us to think of the world as like we can get anywhere and do anything and have anything we want at the drop of a hat. That's our mentality. Then what we're going to be doing is going to take quite a bit of effort and sort of like a chosen way of life. And so, yeah, so there was kind of that realization of like, I'm going to die in this role and in this way of living. It wasn't even just church stuff. I mean, church played a huge role in it, but it was just like my whole life is disintegrated and I need something different. And that's when we started to explore like, well, what does a new version of this look like? And we thought, well, let's look around. And we'd found some other churches that were like, hiring and also like kind of doing this sort of thing. And like, maybe they look like a good like canvas to kind of paint on. But in the end, it came down to reimagining the way we wanted to live and then thinking, well, let's just like start a church in a place that doesn't, have a whole lot of like church plants or church engagement. And let's do that together. And then to the question of like, what is Parish? That became like, how does the institution of the church, how does this group of people who are now committed to each other, how do they take spiritual and social responsibility for a specific geography? So instead of thinking of like, well, we want to be the church to Denver or the Front Range or whatever, like the I-25 corridor. I mean, I don't know, the way people like think of things. We were like, well, let's squeeze that boundary in a lot. And we happen to have landed in a city that is relatively small and densely populated. And we were able to kind of claim the whole thing and say like, okay, Englewood's it. Like, we're going to take spiritual and social responsibility of this place. And there were like 9 of us, so it was like completely impossible. And also like, well, that seems to be the kind of thing that God shows up and does really well, is actually these things that are just sort of impossible. And no one's ever really going to like believe that it could be done. And sure enough, over the last 7 years, some amazing things have happened.
So geography became the boundary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, geographic boundaries. There's some kind of research done around like centered sets and bounded sets, and we kind of went with more of the center set, usually where you have like a kind of a center of gravity, like a gravitational pull that's kind of pulling everyone together, and that can be ideological, that can be personal. Like sometimes this is where we get the cult of personality. Like, so there are human beings that have that gravitational pull just because they've got so much charisma that draws people to them. That can be political. That can be so many different things, right? That center of gravity. There's another way to kind of designate. And that is to think of things in terms of a bounded set. So it's like you think of the boundaries, the boundaries of the sandbox, the guardrails on the highway, the city limits in our case. And just thinking, okay, these are the people, these are the businesses, these are the schools, these are the trails and the trees and whatever that we're responsible for. And we want to see the well-being of this place. And we want to see this place, to experience both preservation and progress. So like, I think like there's a real fine line between like saying we want to see this place flourish and saying we want to just gentrify this place like crazy. There's a fine line between the two.
Yeah.
And I don't know that we've always walked that line as well as I would have liked. But I think we've done the best we can, but yeah, it's geographic, thinking of like, this is my, and then shrinking that down to, for people to think in terms of your specific neighborhood, think in terms of your block. Like, what if your block became like the place that you're responsible for? So we have like we have our parish, and we have like micro parishes that individuals or families are sort of taking responsibility for.
Yeah, like I think there's a hesitation to say, let me put geographical boundaries up, because it offends this kind of way of life we've been trained in of like, but it's not epic. But what if, a bunch of other people want to come, and it's okay. Like maybe if that's going to happen, that's going to happen. But
Yeah. It feels exclusive. And it's like, well, that's the
yeah,
opposite of what we're trying to
right,
be as
right.
Christians, right? Now, what's funny is like we find other ways to be really exclusive, and we seem to be okay with those. But when it comes to geography, we don't want to be exclusive. And part of that's that internet and automobile mentality of like, well, why would we be exclusive in that way geographically? Because we don't have to be anymore. The idea of parish goes back, hundreds of years when you didn't have the ability to leave your town to go church shopping, right? Like you didn't do that. 100, 200 years ago, if you moved into a new town or if you were raised in a town, you never really left that town. You didn't really need to. That town had everything ideally that you needed, from agriculture to, services to religious and spiritual experiences.
It makes me think, I feel like a lot of older stories, so 100, 200 years ago, were centered around an anomaly, which would have been a person leaving their small place for the big city. That was like a kind of a big deal.
Right.
Well, they're going to leave their small farm town to go to New York and become an actor, or to go to LA and, whatever it is. Like the reason we told a lot of those stories back then, I think, was because it was so rare.
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
happened.
Yeah,
Now,
the norm, the 99%, were sort of, kind of raised in a town, stayed in that town, raised their family in that town, and you had multiple generations. Now, interestingly enough, Englewood actually has a lot of that, despite people's ability to leave and go to a new town and it being simple. And there's usually economic constraints that are connected with that. So people who come from kind of like, sort of middle to lower economic realities oftentimes find more generational depth where they live. They don't really go very far. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Mostly it's because family can continue to take care of each other because you have generational overlap over time. So anyway, but I think that the norm was to simply stay. And so if you grew up and you were Methodist and you were, like 100, 150 years ago, you grew up in a town, you were Methodist, you went to the Methodist church. And like the idea there was like, this is our place, this is our parish, this is our, we're borrowing obviously from like Catholic tradition and Episcopal tradition. And there wasn't a sense of, I've chosen this church. It was more like this church chose me and is taking responsibility for me and this neighborhood, and we've lost that somewhere along the way. And there's all kinds of reasons, right? Like why we've lost it, but we're in a stage now where it's like that way of living, that way of doing church or doing family or doing school or whatever has to be chosen because the world around you will not like, facilitate that for you. It's something that really has to be kind of chosen. So.
Speaking about like the early church, like the first century church was all about being patient, that the character of God was patience, that it was kind of hard to get into an early church.
Yeah.
You had to go through
slow. It was really exclusive. Like you want to talk about exclusivity?
Yeah.
Like the first century church was like, you have to go through a full catechesis experience before you could be even like sort of allowed into the like regular worship gatherings. There was a ton of like distrust, for, the government could kill us at any time if we were to, live this out. And B, there was a high sense of like community and inner trust, like trust within kind of in the bounds of the community. And they would sort of like do anything for each other. But you don't just get to like walk into a scenario like that. Like you have to kind of like prove that you wanted to be a part of it. And so, the roots of the local church or the way we think of church are actually kind of deep into this exclusive kind of mindset. And it's really important to delineate between exclusivity and superiority, right? So, and I think that's what's been really like important for me over the years is to think through like, I guess we're being somewhat exclusive by saying we want to be a small church. We want to be a geographically focused church. We want to be a church that where the majority of our people live and or work within the Englewood area. Not all of our people, we have people who come from all over the place, and that's completely fine. And we love them to death, and we hope they continue to be a part of our community. But ideally, like our church's majority, people in this area. And that is exclusive in a way. That does not make us superior to other expressions of church or to people who live in another neighborhood or another community or something like that. So there's a big difference there. And that's one of the things I've seen, like, as I've understood more history about the early church, is there was an exclusivity without a superiority. And that is a really important line to make and draw between the two.
And the exclusivity was all based around the way that we behave with one another. Like taking Jesus' words of, they will know me by the way you love each other. Was like, we're going to live slave and free. Men and women are invited to the table. That made pagans curious.
Because it was weird.
It was weird.
They were like, that is bizarre to us. And like, you take care of, like, I mean, it wasn't uncommon in the first century in that part of the world for, if an infant was born with a deformity or the family just like wasn't able to care for that infant, infanticide was fairly common. And so babies would be left on the side of the street or wherever. And it was not uncommon also for the church in the first century to scoop those babies up and just bring them into the family. I mean, it was like kind of like our first introduction to like adoption and how that would work in like what was considered a modern era at that time. And people saw that happen and they were like, what are you doing? Like, you're taking on tremendous risk. You're taking on, I mean, infants are just resource suckers, right? Like, they just like take up every single resource a family or a community has. And then some of these infants were extra challenging because of their circumstances. And people saw that and they were like, what are you doing? This is so weird. And a lot of them were like, we kind of want to find out more about this,
Yeah, exactly.
Because of how they loved each other, essentially.
Yeah. And just loved vulnerable people who no one else would love.
Who couldn't pay back anything.
Exactly.
I mean, an infant cannot give you anything.
Love was not transactional.
I've had a handful, and they do not give. There's zero reciprocity in raising an infant. Someday, like, they can contribute. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I mean, people are like, "Oh my gosh," but they give you love and smiles and stuff. That ain't. I mean, that's not reciprocity for like what you're pouring into caring for an infant.
Right.
So people saw the early church go like, we're sort of like at the risk of our community resources being depleted. We're going to care for vulnerable people, many of whom could not reciprocate. And I think that, to your point about like, we'll sort of accept any and all who kind of fit within this, whatever their bounded set was, right? I don't know that it was geography, but in our case, it is. You can have that magnanimous leader that, or that ideological gravitational pull. That is a relatively new way of doing church when you look at the entire history of the church, right? Like, the way we think of like evangelicalism and like, everything sort of centers around this one leader or this one group of leaders or this one ideology or whatever, that's relatively new. We've kind of invented that like in the last, 50, 75 years.
Right. Like saying this is Nathan's church or Mark's church or,
would
John
make
Mark
no
Homer's.
sense to someone, a long time ago,
It
essentially.
would actually probably raise a lot of alarm bells. Like,
That'd be a red flag. Yeah. Like, whose church is this? Like, wait, this isn't Jesus's church? Or like, wait, this isn't like this church in this one, that's connected to this neighborhood or whatever, or this place. That's actually, kind of bizarre. And it's why some denominations, Methodist, Lutheran, even Catholic and some other denominations, basically rotate their leadership all the time. So like one of the things that would probably, frankly, keep me out of being, being ordained in the Methodist Church, for instance, is that you have an assignment and you're there for a few years, and then they call you up one day and they move you. You could be moved across the country. And like, I love our place so much that I'm like, no, I can't enter into something that could potentially like uproot me like that.
Yeah.
But that's the way. One of the reasons why they do that is because it doesn't matter how attached you get to your pastor; they're on their way out as soon as they're on their way in.
Yeah.
Right. So it avoids a lot of that, and you become really attached to the church, to the community, to the theology, the sacraments, the practices, whatever it is. Like, you become attached to something else that's not dependent on a person.
Yeah, exactly. Well, movement of those pastors and leaders is like, it can't be only as a promotion. You know,
Yeah.
it's not like people are choosing their own.
Right.
It's still a lot like uprooting
Mm-hmm.
their lives and, you know, attachments they've made. Speaking of kind of the way that we started our church, I remember we used a lot of rhetoric of like, if you're coming here, or we're not going to go and like bring an ice cream truck to a park to try to like bring people in and then say, hey, come to our church. Not bashing that strategy, but it was more so like, I mean, we've established on this podcast, growing in number usually means Christians who are already Christians leaving where they were for this or that reason,
Just reorganizing
and reorganizing.
Yeah.
And it's still happening. Actually, more people are moving. Still, like there are less and less believers in America, but larger churches are actually still kind of growing, although they're at the same time, strangely, are more smaller communities popping up.
Yep.
So, which is like kind of an interesting moment. But one of the things we said was, okay, we realize most people who would be new are probably already Christians. And sometimes they need a new place. Sometimes they come from a toxic environment, of course. But a lot of the times we just said, if you're a part of a church, like that's a good church, stay there, like invest there. We're not better than they are. Like
I'd still pass that advice along to people in our church and say like, hey, if you're, you know, if there was a place where that felt, and honestly, and really the real lens or the real filter that I run this through is like, is there a place, a church that you can get on board with that's closer to where you live or whatever than where we are? Like I'm going through this with a person in our church right now, like kind of helping them navigate. Like I travel pretty far to come to our church. I really love our church and I go, that's great. And I hope that it always holds a special place in your memory. And yet I would love for you to be able to like invest in your community alongside the people in your church, you know, and that's really important to me. So I'm trying to like help them develop that lens and that filter.
But because of that, we're never going to be the sexiest, hippest, coolest church in town.
Yeah, because I'm actually trying to avoid that. Again, that's that gravitational magnetism. I'd actually like for us to do things. I mean, I try to downplay and sort of like deplatform a lot of the things that sort of modern day evangelicalism have elevated to, like, you know, an example would be, and you and I argue about this sometimes, but like the sermon and like the centrality of the sermon. And I love preaching. I love the Bible. I love talking about it and explaining it, and it confounds me and it frustrates me. And it's also this thing like I can't not keep coming back to. But I don't want it to be the apex of our service.
Yeah.
I'd be fine if there was really no like particular apex and if just the whole thing mattered, you know, equally. But if anything's going to be the apex, it's going to be the Eucharist. Like it's going to be this time in our service when we talk about Jesus and like what Jesus has done, because it's the most universal thing that I talk about ever. And I want to talk about it every week. You know what I mean? And so like that's got to be the apex, which means I've got to deplatform and decentralize some of these other things. And the reason why that's pertinent to what we're talking about now is because that process makes things less flashy. It makes things less attention grabbing. Right. Because the purpose of the thing is not to grab your attention. The purpose of the thing is to engage your soul in a unique way.
Yeah. And people, whether or not they know it, you know, that is the apex of our service. Yeah. Whether or not they know it, people are coming, and that's the most consistent rhythm and the apex that, you know, they're not ending up coming because you're teaching. Because they're
not getting a lot of it. And it's like middle of the road. I mean, a lot of times it really is, and that's okay. Like that is actually, I think, helping people see their faith as something other than borrowed from this celebrity style, charismatic, you know, person.
And there's more time for people to chat and be close with one another after a service if the service isn't 2 hours long.
Yeah, you're exhausted after a 2-hour service, right? Yeah, especially if you're kind of like more on the introverted side of the spectrum. Like being around people like that for that long is just like, get me out of here, right? But like even our most introverted people can hang for 60 minutes and then they can like, they've got a little margin before and after to like talk with somebody or, actually build some more relationships. So yeah, there's all kinds of strategy that's kind of built into that the way that we've designed things. And a lot of it's centered on like, how do we essentially take less from people and give more to people.
Right. And moving on kind of from the service. So we've established that like our service is not elevated any more than our work in the community.
Yeah.
So as a part of Parish, we're going to set or kind of a parish model. We're going to set geographical boundaries. People can come in if they want. You're not going to turn people away from the door, but we're going to encourage people to invest where they are. So, okay. And then say we're taking spiritual and social responsibility for this particular geography. That also kind of sounds like, okay, well, you must have a ton of programs. You must have all these things based on your church, but you've made it very clear, like, we don't have the money. We don't have the people. We don't have the resources to create all sorts of programs that would be ideal, so to speak. So you've told me before that, like, you have to operate in existing systems, which is, I'm sure you've learned a lot more about how cities work than you ever would have at your previous megachurch, because they could kind of start whatever they wanted.
Well, it kind of was its own city. Like it had so many of its own programs that you could sort of like exist within that ecosystem. Like you hardly needed to go anywhere else for the things that your basic needs, there was so much that the church offered. And there's definitely like a kind of mentality and a strategy behind that. Like, that's kind of cool that a church has so much resources. They're like, we could basically provide for pretty much all of your needs. Like, that's kind of a neat, like, way of thinking. And like, I think there's a tremendous amount of generosity like behind that. But for two reasons, you identified one, but another reason, and we've done this more strategically. Let's say like a donor shows up tomorrow and is like, here's $1 million. I'm still not starting a bunch of programs. Like, some of it's been for lack of resources, and a lot of it's been because we're like, these programs, whatever you want to call them, these things, rhythms, practices, these exist already in our community. They're, quote unquote, non-Christian versions. They're imperfect in a lot of ways. But our hope is that our people are going and engaging those programs where they are, rather than us inventing our own and saying, if you build it, they will come. Like, let's start a daycare program or something like that. Like, there's a huge need for childcare in our community. There's a huge need for childcare in the state of Colorado in general. But there are daycare and childcare programs already existing in our city. Let's get behind that. Like, let's invest in that. Same with resources for our neighbors experiencing homelessness. Same with resources for, kids and moms and even like kind of like the physical environment. Like, there are things that are happening for that. We don't need to be the ones that are starting it and implementing or originating them.
Yeah,
we can be the ones to help implement them where they are.
And perfection in how they operate is not a prerequisite to engaging them and being a part of them.
It can't be, because you wouldn't do anything.
You wouldn't do anything. That, I'm sure a lot of people use those as an excuse.
Oh, I've watched them do it. It happens in foster care all the time.
Okay.
The system's so broken. I can't participate. And I'm like, but these kids' lives are also, broken. So like, let's engage an imperfect system in order to do real ground level work for people who have tremendous need. Instead of hiding behind this, like, well, when they get it together, all like, no, like, we don't have time for that. We just don't have time for that,
Well, and Jesus didn't do that. Like, he didn't say.
Not from what I can tell. Yeah.
There is no story where he said, if you are right, if the system that you're involved in is correct, then I'll come and hang out with you and talk with you.
It's what the Pharisees thought was going to be the case.
Right. Fix our behavior, or everyone around us, then our Messiah will come.
God will come.
Yeah.
Like, this is how we're going to initiate the arrival of the Messiah, is through like perfect obedience to not just the law as it was given to us, but like also in addition to that, our interpretations of the law. So it just became this like cumbersome, almost impossible task. But they were like, this is the way you usher in the age of the Messiah. And Jesus spent the majority of his time just kind of ripping on them. Like you actually guys kind of missed the point. And I think similarly, we feel like this perfectionism, or even just in like an idealism, even if it's not perfectionism, it's like idealism in our communities or in our churches or whatever, that we use that as an excuse essentially not to engage them, because we're like, well, when they get it together in this area or that area, like I'll jump in. Again, we just don't have time for that. And there's not a Christocentric precedent for that, as you said. Like I don't see that was like the way that Jesus operated.
Yeah, if we're gonna use rhetoric and emphasize any level of evangelism or sharing the message of Jesus with people, how are we going to do that? I mean, we'd like to say any and all are welcome, come as you are, but like people who aren't believers are not walking through church doors.
No.
We know that.
If they are, it's because there's some level of desperation and there's a particular need that needs to be met.
Or someone has engaged a system on the outside and has made it clear to them.
Totally.
We love you. If you're interested in a community, that's going to help you.
Yeah. And I think that common ground principle is also really important. There's this guy who's a part of our church for maybe a year or so, something like that. And his name was Greg. And he doesn't live in Englewood anymore. He's moved. But he was not a believer when he and I met, but loved Englewood. Born and raised here, just thought this place was like the greatest place. And also like knew all of the quirks and warts of the city. So like it was cool because his love for the city wasn't like this kind of glamorous, like he loves all the new stuff in the city. He's like, I know what this city's about. And like, I know its problems and I love it anyways. Right. And he and I developed a relationship because we had like literal common ground. We were both like, we're here for Englewood. Like we're gonna continue to fight for this place and to care for this place and take responsibility for this place. And he and I would get together pretty regularly and we would just talk about Englewood. Like how are we engaged in this place, whatever. And it didn't take long for that to turn into a spiritual conversation, because for me, social responsibility and spiritual responsibility, Parish, is a spiritual act, So like I couldn't keep my spirituality out of it. And he was so receptive to that. And I'll never forget, like, I think it was about a year after he started coming to our church. And he was just coming because we would talk about Englewood all the time. And he was like, your church is the best place to like run into the city manager. Your church is the best place to like see a city council person. And I'm like, that's pretty cool. Like our church became a place where like, if you wanted to rub shoulders with the folks who were in charge, you would come on a Sunday. And I had the pleasure of baptizing Greg because he like eventually was like, oh, this is actually a deeply spiritual thing. And I actually do want to follow the way of Jesus because the way I'm seeing it done is in the literal physical like dirt of our alleys and the literal physical like homes of our neighbors. And and it was inspiring him, and it shifted the way he thought about the world around him. And there was no bait and switch. Like, it was not like, hey, I'm only your friend because eventually I'm going to like, slip a track across the table. It was like, we genuinely had the same interest.
Yeah.
And for some people that's like cycling, and for some people that's skiing, and some people that, whatever. But like for us, it was like the dirt under our feet. And that became common ground for us.
And let's make it clear too. Englewood is like, it's a small city that's sandwiched between a huge city and a
big suburb.
Yep. Littleton, Denver and Littleton. So we can say, taking responsibility for a 3-mile radius is the whole city of Englewood.
Yeah. It's 35,000 people. And it's like actually like we can take the whole city. It's pretty unusual for you to be able to do that. I think the future of parish churches is more neighborhood focused, still geographically bounded, but more neighborhood focused. I've identified there's a few other cities in the Denver metro area, Sheridan being one, Edgewater being another, that are like full blown municipalities. They have their own city council, their own police, their own city manager, like that kind of thing. But they're also like fairly small, where you could say like our parish is the entire city of Edgewater, right?
Yeah.
But that's unusual. Glendale's another example, that kind of thing. Those are pretty unusual. I think that the future of this kind of church, or this sort of model for church, is probably churches saying like, our neighborhood is our bounded set. And the majority of our people are engaged in this neighborhood. Maybe it's because their kids go to school there. Maybe it's because they have a job there. Maybe it's because they live there. Who knows?
Yeah.
But like identifying a geography based more on like neighborhood boundaries than city boundaries. I think we're in a unique situation, to your point.
Yeah, absolutely. It's cleaner. I mean, a little bit cleaner to be able to say, well, like, we can know our city manager and our mayor.
Yeah.
In large part, that's because it's not a very big city. They're they don't have hundreds of thousands of constituents.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. I mean, I think the neighborhood version of that when it comes to government is knowing what city council district you're in, because every person in every municipality lives in a city council district. So maybe you aren't going to know your entire city council because you're not really serving your whole city per se. But you're like, I'm here for my neighborhood. Well, you have a city council person. So that becomes your go-to. That's your gateway into like city government, is getting to know that person, you know, and building trust with them. And that takes forever because like they immediately assume you're up to no good. I mean, that's the assumption for most municipalities, most governments, to like a church or a Christian or whatever, is like, what's your alternative agenda? Like, because they've been yelled at by so many Christians for so long and received so many nasty letters that they're like, I don't want to talk to you. I mean, like that was the case for us when we first started. Like I had to call so many times to get city council people to meet with me. And I mean, the former mayor, Linda Olson, and I are still pretty close. And we joke around about how long it took me to get her to have coffee with me, because she was just like, and she's a believer, and she's like grown up in church and like loves the church. And as a mayor, as a city council person, she had been raked over the coals so many times that she was just like, another guy just coming in to like tell me how to do my job, whatever. And it took me several meetings to convince her, like, I'm on your team.
Yeah.
Like I actually literally just wanted to buy you coffee and like get to know you a bit better.
Tell me what you want from a group of people who love this city. No, that's so good, because and what was it that earned their trust? Consistency, annoyance, probably.
Yeah.
Like
showing up. Yeah. Like showing up and being like a like physical presence in a city council meeting or at a service day or at a parade or whatever it was. It was like, this guy keeps showing up. And when he shows up, he's not just like immediately frustrated and angry.
Yeah.
And what happens is you earn that trust, and then you actually get to speak into the system, you know, and it took us years, you know, but it was showing up to city council meetings. And, you know, if you've ever watched a city council meeting or a school board meeting or whatever, like it's any public comment is usually just like eviscerating a decision that was made or whatever. And we started showing up and just offering encouragement to city council and just saying like, hey, you have a tough job. You're doing a good job. And we're proud of you. And like, we're proud to be part of the city and we're grateful for you. So thanks. And we would just sit down and people would just be like, well, where's the part where you're, you know, just screaming a series of profanities, you know?
Like, what's the worry about 5G?
Yeah, exactly. Like, yeah, totally. Why aren't you talking about that? Like, that's what we're really here for, right? Yeah. And then it was like, you know, 40 years later that I think or it was probably 2 years in when I first made my first like kind of confrontational public comment. And I just kind of tried to say, hey, you recently, or you're on the cusp of making this decision. I have my concerns, and I think you know that like my concerns are founded in not this like specific opinion or like way, but like it's because I care about you and I care about our city. A really good example of that was when we first started. It was kind of within our first year. There was going to be some kind of like swapping of school properties, and they were going to remove an elementary school from our neighborhood. And there was like I said, there was like less than 10 people who were part of our church at that point. But there's enough research around like when you sort of like move an elementary school out of a neighborhood, it has a pretty significant systemic social impact on that neighborhood. And so for the sake of my neighbors and for my kids too, I was like, I don't want them to move this school. I don't think it's good. I don't think it's a good idea. So we started showing up to town hall meetings and just like showing up. We're here. We're mostly just here to listen. We're going to kind of get an idea of what's going on. And when we first started showing up at these town hall meetings, the school board was unanimously in favor of moving the school. And by the way, I just want to clarify, we do not take full credit for any of the things that happened next. There were 100 parents there, okay? And then we were just dropping the bucket. But we were shoulder to shoulder with these other parents saying, we care about this neighborhood, we care about these kids. We think it's best to keep the school where it is.
Right. You were leveraging your communication skills for the sake of all these families to say, I think I can summarize what I've heard from a bunch of people and myself in this community.
I think I can represent my neighbors who aren't here because they hate town halls. Not everybody, town halls aren't for everybody, right?
Yeah.
I think I can summarize the research. I think I can summarize, I can represent an opinion that I've heard from a lot of people, our church included, and here's what we think would be best. And over the course of months and lots of these town hall meetings and phone calls with the superintendent and that kind of thing, we saw the school board do a full switch and became unanimously in favor of keeping the school where it was. And for me, I walk my kids to that school every single day and pick them up there every day. And it's 2 blocks from our house. And there's something about showing up on that campus. And I forget sometimes, but a lot of times I'll show up there on a Monday morning or a Wednesday morning or something and go this thing is here because a group of us earned the trust of the leadership over the course of time, and then spoke what I feel was kind of wisdom into the situation from a unique perspective that swayed a group of elected officials, and it changed the way our neighborhood continues to function. And that just feels like such a gift to have been a part of that. But it required that really adamant, we're about this place, we're about this hood, we're about this geography.
And a lot of the families that had kids going to that school didn't have transport. Those kids had to walk to school. Maybe parents had early jobs or no cars.
It would have been so disruptive to the way, so many kids in our neighborhood walk to school because parents lack transportation. And
it was going to move to a place where they could not.
It would have been a massive barrier for them to get there. And, and then, the solution was we have good busing and we'll do, that kind of thing. And we'll have create bike lanes and that kind of thing. And it was just became you could keep kind of patching the leak, but eventually you've got a leak and you have to you have to repair it.
If it's busing, but parents can't, if a parent needs to get a kid early from school and they don't have a car, how are you going to do that unless you can walk there?
It just kind of causes more problems than it solves. And when we started highlighting those and explaining there's I think the highest percentage of Section 8 housing in the city is in our neighborhood and utilizes that school. I think we also have the highest immigrant population in our community, in the city, in our little neighborhood. And so the school became this place where it was accessible, it was attainable, it gave something back to the community. It became, in many ways our elementary school is a community center. And you can't take that away from a group of people who are dependent on it for, a variety of reasons. And then over the years, as they've rebuilt the school and things, it's become more accommodating. So I got to be on the committee that designed the new school building. And we also have the highest population of students with physical and developmental disabilities. And so how do we create a building that's as inclusive and accommodating as possible? Every placard in the school has English, Spanish, and Arabic on it because our community is made up of English-speaking, Spanish-speaking, and Arabic-speaking people. And that was really important to us. And but again, we didn't get invited to that table until we had sort of proven we are on the same team, we care about the same stuff, and we want to see this place flourish. Not gentrified, flourish.
This is part 1 of my conversation with Nathan Hoag. Join us for episode 9, where we continue our conversation into how focusing on a particular geography can bring about tangible change and spiritual growth. Parish Podcast is a production of Vineworks Film Company. The executive producer is Nathan Hoag. This episode was produced, edited, and hosted by Canaan Hurst. Graphic design and set design by Krysl. Find us on social media at Parish Podcast. Remember to subscribe and rate this podcast wherever you listen. This video podcast has been made possible by the generous support of the Sacred Grace, an incubator and accelerator that's cultivating leaders to take spiritual and social responsibility for their neighbors and neighborhoods. For more information, visit thesacredgrace.com.